All right, now what we want to do is we want to talk about a new kind of problem. And this is called the t-test for two populations. T-test for two populations, and we're asking about the mean. So when you read this problem, it's going to look very similar to the z problem we just did. The key difference is sigma 1 and sigma 2 are unknown. That's the key difference. Everything else, as far as assumptions are concerned, are basically going to be the same because we're going to have interval or ratio data, we're going to have independent random samples, we're going to have a normal distribution for the populations, and we're going to have equal variances. So all four of those things are still the same. The only difference is the population variances are unknown. The way I'm going to know that is when I read the problem. If it talks about variances or standard deviations, where do the numbers come from? That's the question. Are they given as existing for the population, or are they based on a sample that we've taken? Do they talk about a sample, or do they talk about the population? If they are the sample values, we have to use t. If they are population values, we can use z, like we just did. Okay, so let's go back to our PowerPoint slides then. We're going to look at a t-test. Here's our situation. We have two variances again, but these are standard deviations. They're unknown, but assumed equal. So we still have the assumption of equal variances. The difference is the standard deviation or the variances are not given. So that's why we can use this approach. Samples are randomly and independently drawn, and the populations are normal. Both sample sizes are at least 30, and our variances are unknown but assumed equal. Okay, so in this situation, everything's the same except for whether we know the variances or not. Okay, so now we're ready to look at a sample problem. Here's what our formula looks like first. It looks pretty difficult, but the truth is it's not as bad as it seems. We have to calculate what's called the pooled variance, S squared P, and that is found by looking at n minus 1 times s squared 1 plus n2 minus 1 times s squared 2 over the degrees of freedom. Degrees of freedom formula is similar to what it was before, n1 minus 1 plus n2 minus 1. So we're going to combine those. Really, we could. That'd be n1 plus n2 minus 2 would give me the same thing on the denominator there. So I'm going to find s squared p, I'm going to plug it into the formula for t, and then I'm going to solve to find out what t is. Okay, this formula is used when the standard deviations are unknown. That's the key thing to remember. All the other assumptions are the same as they were for z. Okay, here's an example problem. You are a financial analyst for a brokerage firm. Is there a difference in dividend yield between stocks listed on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ? And this is the sample data that you came up with. You know you have 21 and 25 in your samples. Sample means are 327, 253, and the sample standard deviation is 1.3 and 1.16. Notice these are sample standard deviations. That's why I'm having to use t instead of z. If they were population values, we could use z. We're assuming the populations are normally distributed with equal variances. Here's the question. Is there a difference in average yield? Two key words there would be difference, that tells me it's a two-tailed test, and average, which means we're talking about the mean. Okay? Average, difference, and we have sample standard deviations, so it's got to be a t problem. Okay? That's what you want to be able to do, is recognize what kind of problem it is. That's your hard job. Because the sample standard deviation is given and not the population values, and we assume normal distribution and equal variances, we're going to be using t. We want to know if there's a difference in the average. So that means we're talking about means, and we're going to do a two-tailed test because it's asking me about the difference. Alpha equals 0.05, which is what I would have used if the problem didn't tell me anything. Okay, here's how I calculate my step 5 value. T is equal to 3.27 x bar 1 minus 2.53 minus, and again, the sample means, population means are assumed to be the same, which means there is zero difference. I've got to find s squared p, which is called the pooled variance. So I take this formula, plug into the formula, and I get 1.5021. Plug that up here. These are my sample sizes, 21 and 25, and I solve to find t, which is equal to 2.04. Okay, so let me go back and kind of show you how to do this with the 6 steps, because that's the way I want you to do it, is show me each of those 6 steps. So here's at least a part of that. Step 1, mu1 minus mu2 equals 0, or mu1 equals mu2. The alternative is mu1 is not equal to mu2. And the reason I knew it was equal and does not equal is because it asked me about a difference. That's step 1. Step 2, alpha equals 0.05. Degrees of freedom are 21 plus 25 minus 2 is 44 degrees of freedom. So to find my critical value in step 4, wait a minute, we'll better go back to step 3. So step 2 is simply the alpha level and the sample sizes, which would be N1 equals 21, N2 equals 25. Step 3, this is a t-test for the difference of two means. How do I know? Because only the sample standard deviations are given, not the population standard deviations. I still have all the other assumptions for my z-test, 2 populations, I'm talking about the mean, I have interval or ratio data, independent random samples, normal distribution. Okay, so my critical value I'm going to find in the table. What table? The t table, different table than we've used before. So let me show you how to find that value. We go to our table, we use the degrees of freedom, which is N1 plus N2 minus 2, and that gives me 21 plus 25 minus 2 is 44 degrees of freedom. My alpha level for this problem was 0.05, and it is two-tailed. So what I'm going to have to do, I'm looking at page 554 in the back of our book now, I'm going to have to use the upper tail area, which is half of that 0.05, 0.025, because it's a two-tail test. My degrees of freedom were 44, so I go to that line and find the value that I want. The critical value is 2.0154, 44 degrees of freedom, upper tail area 0.025, half of 0.05, 2.0154. Okay, so I just find that value in my table, and then that's step 4. I just write it down, which says if I get a value out here in the tails, I'm going to reject the null. If I get something in the middle, I will fail to reject the null. So, ready for step 5. I already plugged into the formula, remember, on the last slide. The value I obtained was 2.04, so I put that on my diagram now, and it is out in the upper rejection region, so I'm going to reject the null with an alpha level of 0.05. That's step 6. What I believe is mu1 is not equal to mu2. I have 95% confidence in that decision because alpha is 0.05, and I'm willing to change policy if I can live with 95% confidence. Okay, now, the only other thing I need to do is figure out my p-value that corresponds to this 2.04. One thing I would notice is it's very close to the critical value, 2.0154. Because those values are so close, my guess is my answer is going to be sensitive to the level of alpha. So make sure that you tell me whether it's sensitive. My guess would be yes, but I can confirm that by calculating my p-value. So let's show you how to do that. Whoops, they didn't do that. So we'll back up and show you. Okay, let me go to the whiteboard. I'm going to use 204 is my calculated value. I always start in step 5, remember. And I had 44 degrees of freedom. Okay, so let's go to our table and show us how to do that. 2.04 is what I'm looking for in the table. I'm in the t table, and I'm going to use 44 degrees of freedom. If it doesn't have exactly the degrees of freedom that you're looking for in the table, what I would do is either round down or estimate between the values that it does give you. So here it goes to 44, so I can use exactly that value. What I'm trying to find is 2.04, and that value would be between, I'm in the same row, 44 degrees of freedom, 2.0154 and 2.4141. They correspond to upper tail areas of 0.025 and 0.01. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write those two values down. I'm going to calculate my p-value now. Calculated value of t, calculated t is equal to 2.040. Okay, and this is my step 5 value, remember. So I'm going to find my p-value. I'm going to look up this value in the table under 44 degrees of freedom. I'm going to get as close to that value as I can get. Now the two values I found in the table were 0.025 and 0.01. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the smaller value over here and the larger value on the right side. And I'm going to say P is between 0.01 and 0.025. Now remember, was this a one or a two-tailed test we were working here? The problem that I was looking at was two-tailed. It said difference, is there a difference? So what I've got to do is multiply each of these values by 2 because I have the same probability on each side of the distribution. So here is my p-value. P is between 0.02 and 0.05. Because P is between 0.01 and 0.10, that says my answer is sensitive to alpha. Which means if I change my alpha level, it's going to change my answer. Okay, I used an alpha level of 0.05, which is why I was able to reject the null. But if I change my alpha level to 0.01 or 0.02 or something like that, I'm not going to be able to reject the null. So the best way to think about that is, if this is P between 0.02 and 0.05, I can have between 95 and 98% confidence, which is 1 minus P. That's what I actually have. If alpha is 0.05, I'm going to be able to reject because I only have to have 95% confidence. But if I change alpha to 0.01, that means now I need 99% confidence, and I'm not going to be able to reject because I have less than that. So that's why we're saying my answer is sensitive to alpha. The way to explain the p-value is to say it's between 0.02, 0.05, which gives me between 95 and 98% confidence if I were to reject the null. If alpha is less than 0.05, I'm not going to be able to reject the null. If it's 0.05 or greater, I would be able to reject the null, which I've done in this case. All right, so that gets us through the Z problem and the T problem there, those examples. And it won't hurt for you to work some more problems like that, I'm sure. But what we want to do is, rather than just making the assumption, which we have been so far, that the variances are equal, notice we did that for both of these two kinds of tests, the Z or the T. What we're going to do is we're going to say, let's not assume that. Let's see if we can figure out whether that's really true or not. So to do that, we're going to use our computer. We're going to do an Excel problem now. We're going to show you how to solve a lot of these problems without having to do all the work by hand. We can do it primarily with the computer. Okay, this is a problem that we want to look at, which is an example problem in the chapter. And I'll go through this step by step because you're going to have to do this on the computer as well. So I want to make sure you know how to do that. And this problem, let's show you what page the data is found on first. And then we'll kind of work through it and show you where the information is coming from. Okay, this data is found on page 314, table 10.1. What we have here is we have two different locations for which we can display our cola that we're trying to sell. We can either put it in the normal location, which is like along the aisle, shelf aisle, or we can put it at the end of the aisle. And the question we're trying to answer is, does it matter? Does it matter whether we put it at the end of the aisle or whether we put it in the shelf along with all the others? Does the level of sales change as a result of where we display the cola? All right, so we can look at the data on page 314. We can realize there's two sets of data. There's one sample is from the normal aisle and the other is the end of the aisle. So what we want to do, and in fact, just so you know, there's a data disk in the back of your book that has all this data already on it. It's called COLA in this case, C-O-L-A. So if you look on that data disk, you should be able to find this set of data. Now it may be that all the data is listed in one column. If that's the case, you'll have to copy it and put it into 2 columns. Alternatively, you could just create it and enter the data yourself. So let me just show you from a blank spreadsheet sort of what we're doing here, so you can get to the same place that I am. Okay, here's a blank spreadsheet. It has rows and columns. What I want to do is I want to enter my data. I can do that, as I said, either from the data disk that you may have in the back of your book, or if you don't have that data disk in the back of the book, let me show you another trick that may help. Okay, if you go to the internet website for the book where you found your PowerPoint slides, or you could find PowerPoint slides, this is the address that you want to use. It's written on the front of your textbook, so if you forget, you can just look there to find it. It says prinhall.com/Levine, which is the name of one of the authors. If you go into that website, what you'll find is, if you scroll down a little bit, you'll find our textbook, which is the Levine, Crable, and Berenson book. Under Companion Website, if you click on that, you will find material on each of the chapters. We're in chapter 11 right now, so we can go to chapter 11. It gives you some self-study quizzes. It gives you some PowerPoint slides, which we've already talked about. It also has data files. So if you click on the data files there, since we're using Excel, I would use Excel, you can save these data files onto another disk if you want to. They are what we call compressed data files, so you can't really directly open them. It won't work very well, but if you save them on another disk, then you can ask for the file COLA, and it'll be not compressed anymore, and you'll be able to read it and copy it to a disk or to anything you want to copy it to, or just print it, actually, for that matter. So if you don't have your disk in the back of the book, it's helpful to know that that data is found on the web page. Okay? So go to that if you need to. Remember, your PowerPoint slides are here, so you can be printing them out and bringing them to class if you want to. That's up to you. And so let's get out of there, and we'll go back to where we were. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to obtain our data, which again, you can just enter it if you want to. You can put in a heading like normal. Okay, that's the heading for one type of data, and then you can put in the other kind, which would be called end of the aisle. So put in your headings, then go through and list your data in the columns that follow right in through here. All right, I've already done that, so I'm simply going to go over to that information, and there it is. I've made it a little bigger just so it's easier for you to see, but I've already got all the data put in there just like they gave it to us. I have a heading there which is called normal and end of the aisle, and now I'm ready to analyze my data. Okay, so what I want to do is, remember the first thing I'm going to have to do is I'm going to say, well, gee, I've got 2 populations here. I want to know whether the means are equal, but before I can test to find out if the means are equal, I need to make sure whether the variances are equal or not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this data and I'm going to conduct a test. And I'm going to go to Tools, Data Analysis. Now remember, if data analysis is not there, you've got to go to Add-ins right here. And it'll say, what do you want to add? And we'll say the first 2, Analysis Tool Pack, Analysis Tool Pack VBA. When you hit OK, when you go back in, remember, that data analysis is going to be there. All right? These are the options that it provides us with. So what we want to do first is we want to go to descriptive statistics, which just tell us the means and the standard deviations and all that stuff for each of the sample data that we have. We have to click Summary Statistics, confidence level for the mean to do that. And we have to tell the computer where the data is. So I would say A1 ... B11. You can also just block the data if you prefer to do that. That'd be fine. we do have labels in the first row, so you want to make sure that you tell the computer you have labels in the first row. Otherwise, it'll be thinking that these words are supposed to be numbers, and the computer will get confused. So you can use that to analyze your data, and I don't need to do that right now, so I'm just going to cancel out of there. What I really want to find out is, before I do my test, I want to find out whether the variances are equal or not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a test for the variances. And this is really found in, if you look in your textbook, found in section 4 of chapter 10. We skipped section 3, at least for right now. We're doing section 4, which begins on page 338. Now what we're really doing here is not testing the means anymore, but we're testing the variances to find out whether the variances are equal or not. Okay? So my hypothesis is going to have to do with the variances, not the means. The null is going to say variance 1 for normal is the same as the variance for end of aisle, which is group 2. Okay, so I'm going to do Tools, Data Analysis, and I'm going to do F-test to sample for variances. So you go to where it says that on your sheet, and you click OK, and then you've got to tell the computer where your data is. So we'll say again, A1, that's the first cell, A1 dot dot B11. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't do it that way. We've got to do them separately now. So I've got A1 dot dot A11, and then in the other column, I've got B1 dot dot B11. And I also have labels, so I got to put that in there. All right, now here's the trick. When I do my F-test for variances, because of the way the computer has set it up, if I want alpha to equal 0.05, I have to take the alpha level and divide it by 2, because the computer is only going to give me a one-tailed alpha value. And what I want is rejection region on the lower end and rejection region on the upper end, because I'm testing to see whether the variances are equal. So if it's supposed to be 0.05, make sure you change your alpha to 0.025. If it's supposed to be 0.01, make sure you change it to 0.001. Because that way the computer will give you the correct values. Okay, so change your alpha. You got your labels in. You know where to find the data. So now we can click OK, and it's going to give me those results. So I'm going to just back out of here because I've already done that. And here's what I've got. This is called my F-test to sample for variances. So what I'm doing is I'm testing the variances to see whether we can assume they're equal or not. Okay? Now, I'm going to show you on my smartboard the steps that are going to be involved in this process. Okay, this is called F-test for variances. I'm testing the variances, remember, not the means, and I've got two populations. All right? So, the conditions for this test, let's talk about those. Make sure you've got them. Those are good questions for objective questions, good sources of objective questions. Interval or ratio data, yes. Talking about means and standard deviations. We have normal distributions still, yes. We have two independent samples. The values are not related to each other, and they are random. Okay, so we're testing the variance. So the question would have to say something about the variance or the standard deviation, not the mean. That's how I would know to do this rather than the other test, the z-test or the t-test. Okay, so this kind of test then is what we're going to be examining. Let's go through the several steps. Okay, first step is, for this problem, null hypothesis. Null hypothesis is sigma squared 1 equals sigma squared 2. Alternative hypothesis is sigma squared 1 is not equal to sigma squared 2. So are the variances equal or not? My assumption is always that they're equal while I'm doing the test. The alternative is that they're not equal. Step 2. Okay, I have two populations, so I want to write down my sample sizes. So I'm going to have to go back to my data to find out what they were, if we can't remember exactly. Okay, we had 10 observations under normal. We had 10 observations under end of the aisle. So that means I'm doing okay. It looks like my data was handled correctly. Okay, so we're going to go back to the smartboard. We're going to say and 1 equals 10, and 2 equals 10. Alpha level is 0.05. Remember? Yep, alpha equals 0.05. Step 3, what kind of problem are we doing? Well, because we're talking about variances, we're doing an F-test. F-test, 2 sample for variances. That's what we want to know about, are the variances. Okay, so we should put down the other assumptions. Interval or ratio data. We have 2 populations. We have normal distributions. We have independent random samples. And we're testing the variances. Okay, so we're ready for step 4. Now this is where it becomes a little bit tricky when I get to step 4, because the computer is going to give me one of the values that I'm looking for, and I have to find the other value. So let's see what the computer gives me first of all. Okay, the computer says, and I'm looking for step 4 now, so I'm looking at the critical one-tail value for F, which is 4.026. That's what the computer gave me, 4.026. The computer will give me the right value there as long as I remember to divide my alpha level by 2. Otherwise, it'll give me the wrong value there, because this is the one-tailed area, 4.026. Okay, so we'll go back to our smartboard, and we will say critical F equals 4.026. Okay, now what we're really looking at here, it's a normal distribution. So we've got an upper tail area, upper tail value, 4.026. Out here I'm going to reject, but I also need a lower tail area. To find the lower tail area, as long as my sample sizes are equal, I just take the reciprocal, 1 divided by 4.026. Okay, that's going to be my lower tail critical value. Okay, so that value is, down here, 0.248. Okay, now remember, let me remind you again, how do you do that? Whatever value the computer gives you, you take the reciprocal of that is going to be your other critical value. If the value they gave you is real small, and you divide by that small value, you're going to get a big value. One of the values should be big, one should be small. When I'm testing variances, I always make it a two-tail test, which means upper and lower values are going to cause me to reject. All right, now, the other thing to tell you, even though we don't need to use it right now, we might have to at some point is, what if our sample sizes are not equal? What do we do now? All right, we still do the same thing up to this point. We find 4.026, but let's say, for instance, that instead of the values that we had here, which were 10 and 10 observations, let's say we had 10 in one group and 9 in the other group, which we could do. So let's call it 9 and 10. When the computer gives me the value from the table, that's going to be one of them, but then to find the other value, what I have to do is I have to reverse the degrees of freedom. Right now, notice they're 9 and 9. But if I had 9 as my first sample for the normal group, 10 for the second sample, my degrees of freedom would be 8 and 9. So that value would be given by the computer, as long as I remembered to divide my alpha level. To find the other critical value, what I have to do, though, is reverse the degrees of freedom. With unequal sample sizes, I have to reverse the degrees of freedom. So instead of 8 and 9, I'd have 9 and 8. So let's go to our table and see what we get when we do that. My numerator degrees of freedom are going to have to be 9. My denominator is going to have to be 8. Okay, it's going to give me a different value than what I get with 8 and 9, because now I've reversed the numerator and denominator degrees of freedom. So it does matter what order I put them in there. Okay, this is an F problem. I'm going to start out with 0.05 as my upper tail area. I'm sorry, we have 0.05. If we had 8 and 9, it would be 0.025 as the upper tail area. And this is table E5. What I'm going to look up now, instead of 8 and 9, is 9 and 8. So I'd get 9 for numerator, 8 for denominator. And I would get 4.36. 9 for numerator, 8 for denominator. 4.36. The computer would have given me the value 8 and 9, which is 410. Okay? So the computer would give me 410. I'd reverse the degrees of freedom. It would give me then 9 and 8, which is 4.36. Then what I'd have to do is take the reciprocal of that value. So 1 divided by, let me write it down here for you so you don't forget. Okay, if we had unequal sample sizes, if we had 9 and 10, okay, then my degrees of freedom would equal 8 and 9. It's always 1 minus whatever we've got. The computer then would give me the value, what did we just say? I forgot, 8 and 9. Okay, the computer will give me one of these values correctly as long as I remember to divide my alpha level. Okay, so 8 and 9. Computer would give me 410. Then I've got to reverse the degrees of freedom, 9 and 8. And that's going to give me a new value from the table. Look in the table, 9 and 8, 4.36. All right, that's not my answer though, remember. What I've got to do is take 1 divided by that would be my other critical value. 1 divided by 4.36 would be one value. The other one would be 4.10. Okay, so that's the tricky part, is finding my critical values in the table. If it's equal sample sizes, just take the number they give you, find the reciprocal, and you've got it. If they're unequal sample sizes, take the number they give you, reverse the degrees of freedom, and find the reciprocal of that value, and you've got it. Okay, so now we're ready for step 5. Step 5 is where I find the value for f. So all I've got to do here, I don't need to calculate anything, just go to my printout and see what it said. Okay, my calculated value of f is 2.23, we'll say, or 2.229. So we'll put that on a diagram then. F equals 2.229. That's the calculated value of f. So if I go to my diagram, 2.229, it's going to be in the middle. And therefore, in step 6, my decision is going to be, since it's not out in the tails, I'm going to fail to reject. HO. Okay, that means I think the variances are equal. I'm not convinced, but I think the variances are equal. I've got 0% confidence. Oops, I don't need that. 0% confidence. And therefore, I can assume equal variances. Assume equal variances. And therefore, I can proceed to use either the z-test or the equal variance t. Or z, depending on whether my standard deviations for the population are given or not. Okay, now, if I rejected the null, I would not be able to use the z-test or the t-test that assumes equal variances. I would have to use the separate variance t-test, which is also under your data analysis portion of the Excel data analysis section, and you would use that one in lieu of the equal variance test. So depending on what your results come out to be, that tells you which test to do next. So here's my 6 steps. What I want so far is, on the next kind of problem we're going to give you to do, I want to know, what does your computer data look like? Give me a data sheet. Give me a F table, or give me an F result, which is your analysis of variance for the 2 groups you have. Are they equal? Are they not equal? And then write up your 6 steps. Okay, now we're ready to go to the next part. The next part is use the z or the t or the separate variance t, whichever one is appropriate, to solve the problem. Okay, so in this case, let's look back at the problem and make sure what we have, and we'll know what to do then. All right, we have small samples. We have variance. Now we've got to look at the problem and see where these numbers came from. So this is the example in the chapter, remember? So it's on page 314. We go back to that page. We have raw data, and when they're calculating the variances, these variances are from the sample. Okay, so that's important for me to know. Because they came from the sample, that means I can't use a z-test. I've got to use a t-test. Because the variances were found to be equal, now I've got to use the equal variance t-test, or the pooled variance version of the t-test. Okay? So, then I could proceed to do a t-test on this data, and this is how it's going to work. Let's go back to our data again. Okay, I'm going to go to sheet 1. Here's my raw data. All right, so now what we want to do, we've discovered that the variances are equal, so now we're ready to do the appropriate test. Because the values that were given are only sample standard deviations, we're going to use the pooled variance t-test. So let me go to my tools, data analysis. Down here toward the bottom we find two sample assuming equal variances. That's the one we want to use. So we go to OK. Stupid thing. And now we're going to tell the computer where the data is found again. So we're going to have A1 to A11. Okay, then we're going to have B1, B11. Hypothesized mean difference is always 0, because we don't think there is any difference. We need our labels, and then we have our alpha level. Here we don't need to change the alpha. Whatever the alpha is that's given, which doesn't have to be 0.05, just use the alpha we're given. And then we hit OK, and it'll give us the next page. So let's go to that. Okay, so here are the t-test results, and we can see that we have calculated value of t, we have critical values of t for both 1 and 2 tails, and we also have p-values. So we're good to go. So now what we're going to do is we're going to write up our 6 steps again, and we see we're testing the mean now. That's the key thing. We're looking at means, not standard deviations. So we're going to say we think the means are equal, and this is what we found in our samples, 50.3, 72, etc. Okay, so let's go to our smart board and go through those steps. Let's get a new page. Okay, so we're going to do our t-test. We're going to go through the 6 steps. First step, null hypothesis is mu1 equals mu2. This is a 2-tail test, so that's why I'm doing it this way. Alternative is mu1 is not equal to mu2. Step 2, we have a interval of ratio data. Interval of ratio, we have 2 populations. We found now we have equal variances, so we can say that. And we're talking about the mean. And the other thing is sigma 1 and sigma 2 are unknown. That's why we're using t. So it's going to be a t-test for equal variances. Okay. And we're testing the means. All right. Step 3. I'm sorry, that should be step 3. Step 2, we just need to say the sample sizes. N1 equals 10, N2 equals 10, and alpha equals 0.05. Okay, that was step 3. Now we're ready for step 4. Step 4 is my critical value. And we want a critical value of t. It's a 2-tail test, and my alpha level is 0.05 divided by 2. That means 0.025. All right, 0.025. And the critical value I can simply find from my spreadsheet. 2-tail critical 2.1009. 2.1009. Okay, it's 2-tailed, so it's got to be plus or minus. So if I want to draw a diagram of that, it's going to look like this. 2.1009 and minus 2.1009. Here's my rejection region. Here's my other rejection region. I'm ready for step 5. To find my calculated value, I just go back to my spreadsheet again. T-stat is minus 3.045. Okay, so t equals minus 3.045. That's down here, minus 3.045. Step 6, I'm going to reject the null because I'm out in that lower region. Reject the null, and my alpha level is 0.05, so I've got at least 95% confidence. I believe that the means are not equal. Mean 1 is not equal to mean 2, and therefore what I'm going to do is change policy. So what I'm going to do in my write-up now at the end is just say, I don't believe the means are equal, and I've got at least 95% confidence. Now the only other thing I could do is find out whether it's sensitive to alpha. My guess is it's not sensitive to alpha because this value, minus 3.045, is well below the critical value of 2.1009. But let's find out for sure. Let's go to our Excel. We look for the p-value that corresponds to 2 tail, and the answer is 0.007. So all I've got to do is write it down. P equals 0.007. Okay, subtract from 1, and I've got 99.3% confidence. Because this value is not between 0.01 and 0.10, I would say my answer is not sensitive to alpha, which is what I would have expected because it's a pretty big difference right here. Okay, so we will give you an assignment then that will require you to give me several things. I want to have all the computer printouts, the raw data, I want to have the F-test results, and I want to have the T-test results or Z-test results, whichever one is appropriate, one of the 3 choices. The 3 choices being Z-test for equal variances, T-test for equal variances, or the separate variance T-test. Let me show you where to find that in case you need to use it. Remember, you don't have to worry about it too much. All you've got to do is tell the computer what you want to do. Data analysis, unequal variances. That's the one you would use if you decided that you needed the unequal variance test because you rejected on the F-test. Z-test I would do as long as the population standard deviations are given. Okay, so you're going to have 2 write-ups then, 2 6-step problems, one for F and one for T or Z. Turn in all the computer printouts, and that's the end of that section.